Right, well, it looks like everyone's here super efficiently. No one's on mute, which is marvellous. So I think we're ready to get going. This is the Religion Media Centre podcast, and you are very welcome to it, if you see what I mean. I'm Hannah Scott-Joynt. With me, as usual, journalists Leo Devine and Rosie Dawson. Good morning, team.
Good morning.
Good morning, Hannah.
Marvellous. You are both there. Let's talk about what's caught our eyes, our collective eyes this week. Leo, how about you?
Well, I'll tell you what caught my eye this week. The midterm elections are coming up in the US next week. You may have heard our wonderful Zoom conference, which we had here on the Religion Media Centre, presented by you, Rosie.
Taking a bow. Yes, it was very interesting.
Yeah, very good.
And available on the website and everywhere else.
But the reason it caught my eye is there's a very striking story published by the JTA this week, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, concerning one of the Republican candidates. Johnny Teague is the Republican nominee in the Texas 7th District, and he's also an evangelical pastor. His candidature has revealed that he's the author of a book which is called The Lost Diary of Anne Frank. I don't need to tell you that Anne Frank, of course, is the young Jewish girl who wrote a diary whilst in hiding in Amsterdam before being betrayed to the Nazis and was subsequently murdered in Belsen. Now, what Mr. Teague has done is to basically rewrite the world's most famous diary, or to reimagine her final days in Belsen, where apparently, according to him, she all but converts to Christianity. He depicts her becoming very interested in Christianity, put it that way. She says at the end, in his words, every Jewish man and woman should ask questions like, where is the Messiah? Did he come already? And we didn't recognize him. And not surprisingly, it's been greeted with absolute horror by Jewish groups. To tamper with Anne Frank's diary, one of the most recognizable Jewish victims of the Holocaust, someone who died because of her Jewish faith, to tamper with that has been seen as deeply, deeply offensive.
Absolutely. I mean, you just don't do that. You really don't. But he seems to be finding all kinds of ways to justify it.
Yeah, absolutely. And he, just to give you a flavour of what his political stance is, he's standing on a platform of close the border, and his website tells us that fossil fuels are okay because God gave them to us, so therefore there's nothing wrong with them.
Right. There we are. Rosie, how about you?
Also two Jewish stories. One rather more cheerful. The chief rabbi, you may have heard, is going to have sleepover at Clarence House on the night before the coronation. Because
that sounds fun. I wonder what happens there.
Well, the night before the coronation, you think there might be a bit of an ease up. Anyway, the coronation's taking place on May the 6th, which is Shabbat, of course. And so in order to allow the chief rabbi to attend the coronation, he's going to stay with his wife at Clarence House so that he can walk to Westminster Abbey, which is less than a mile away, the next day, and not take a car, which would be breaking Sabbath rules. So that's a really lovely story. A more worrying story, Israeli story. We've heard about the far-right gains in the Israel elections. There are two rather different takes from Jewish newspapers in this country, which alerted me. The Jewish News headline, this is our worst fears. The Jewish Chronicle editorial said, we might not like it, but it's not for us to tell Israelis how to vote or to make preconditions on our support for Israel, by which I assume they mean the Israeli government. This has raised some eyebrows about what the Israeli government would have to do, which might lead the Jewish Chronicle to actually criticise it. I mean, both the Jewish Leadership Council and the Board of Deputies say they're really concerned about the far-right gains which have brought Benjamin Netanyahu back to power, and urging support for those who share the values of democracy, pluralism and inclusion.
Well, the one that I've been keeping an eye on this week is that Church of England bishops have been meeting to discuss the ban on same-sex blessings and marriage in church. And it's the culmination of a lengthy consultation exercise, Living in Love and Faith, which has been happening in churches over the past couple of years, allowing people to speak honestly and openly about their positions on this. And although this week's discussions are confidential, yesterday the Bishop of Oxford, the Right Reverend Stephen Croft, broke ranks to put out a really significant paper saying that clergy should be free to bless and marry same-sex couples, acknowledging the pain that the church's position has caused, but also saying that his own views have been slow to change, and admitting and acknowledging that those views across this time of change have caused genuine hurt. And he is absolutely the most senior church figure to say that. We won't hear the outcome of this week's meeting for a few months, and there's due to be a vote on it at February's General Synod. But this is a really, really big step. And already the bishops of Worcester and the bishops of Worcester and Dudley have put out a statement aligning themselves this morning with Stephen Croft's position. So it does look as if there is proper movement on this issue. People obviously sit in very different camps for this, for very deep and profound reasons. But this has been a process, and it looks very much as if there is some kind of a sea change happening. And certainly in the letter from the bishops of Worcester and Dudley, it says people do not choose their sexuality and all should be able to express it within loving, committed relationships. This is a big change and a big step. And obviously we will see what happens over the next few months. But these are very significant statements by several Anglican bishops. So a reminder that those stories and many, many others come out on a daily news bulletin, which the Religion Media Centre puts out. And you can have sent straight to your inbox first thing each weekday morning. If you don't subscribe already, you can do so via the website, which is religionmediacentre.org.uk. Now, also this week, the first G20 Global Religion Forum, known as the R20, has been happening in Bali with 300 world religious leaders attending. It's the initiative of the Indonesian government, which holds the G20 presidency this year and has the largest Muslim population in the world, an estimated 231 million. And Rosie, you were due to do an interview for us with the Anglican Primate of the Church of Nigeria yesterday morning, but for reasons I don't fully understand, it didn't end up happening. So would you care to share with the group what went on, or rather very much didn't?
Well, the Archbishop of Nigeria, who's called Henry Nkuba, I think took the opportunity to go to the R20 specifically to raise the position of Christians in his country who he says are at risk of genocide. The extremist violence there affects Muslim communities as well, but local populations of Christians are fleeing their land and property. He spoke to the summit about the ever-increasing number of orphans and homeless people who've lost everything, and he was pleading with the Muslim leaders at this conference to do everything that they could to stop the flow of arms to extremists and to bring any bearing they could to influence the extremists to see that, this just isn't the way to go. So I was all ready for this Zoom interview at 9 o'clock yesterday, arranged by our own Michael Wakelin, who's chair of the Religion Media Centre and who was in Bali, not paid for by the RMC, I hasten to add. And 9 a.m. came and went, and I was sitting, waiting, passing the time and doing Wordle and that sort of thing. And then there was a flurry of WhatsApp messages from Michael. The first one began, "Lord, give me strength. The Archbishop has said he can't do it." And then he proceeded to tell me that the conference press office had sent the cavalry to get him. He said that his favourite bishop had gone on his mobility scooter to try and winkle the Archbishop out of his room. And
hang on. There's an image in itself.
Well, there is. He sent me a picture. And we thought we were dealing with a member of the Episcopal Awkward Squad, I have to say. And Michael was worrying because he was going to be spending 13 hours with this Archbishop in an airport departure lounge and on an aeroplane. And I was rather enjoying all this. However, this is where the fun stops, because finally we heard that the reason that the Archbishop wasn't going to do the interview was that because he'd been receiving messages from Nigeria who'd been hearing what he had said in Bali, and they were telling him that it was simply too dangerous for him to say anything else. So it kind of, brought me up short, really, and just sort of underlined the situation that's facing Nigerians every day.
Yes, and I mean, absolutely underlines exactly what he'd been talking about in his opening speech. I mean, it has been an interesting couple of days, but my understanding of it is that they were sort of trying to replace something called the IF20, the Interfaith 20, which has been in existence for 18 years and has been all about providing policy documents for the G20 leaders at their summit. So meeting just beforehand to put together some stuff to give to the G20. And it feels as if this was a replacement for that. But Interfaith 20, IF20, has said that they're going to reconvene in Abu Dhabi later this year, and they've stated their intention to be at all future G20 meetings. So quite how the two are going to coexist, or whether that's going to work at all, I don't know. But I mean, it seems as if this was very much about working towards, urging leaders to work towards putting an end to wars so that future generations can live in peace. And it's difficult to know whether those kind of statements can have teeth with the G20. Do you get any sense of that, Rosie?
No, but I think what the Indonesian government may have been doing, because the G20 is being held in Indonesia, was to really get the Muslim world on board with trying to speak to the G20. So it was organised by the Muslim World League and an organisation in Indonesia called Nahdlatul Ulama, and the Saudis were also there. And so they had very different sort of complexions of Islam represented at the R20. I mean, I just have to tell you this. When I Googled R20, it's not very well known. Well, it wouldn't be, would it? Because it's just been set up. R20 is also a tattoo laser removal service. So hopefully the R20 in Indonesia will have made a bit more of an impact so that it comes top of my Google search in future.
I'm glad you said that, Rosie, because a note of naivety, I'd never heard of it. Am I allowed to say that?
Yeah, because it has only just set up, so it's I think maybe we can be forgiven for not having heard about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I think let's acknowledge the fact that we're not experts on this, and maybe we will hear more from Michael about it at some point. But I will say that there is a really good sort of basic briefing document from Michael on the RMC website. I keep referring to it this morning, but for very good reasons, because there's a lot of extremely good stuff on there. So I think we'll move on at this point to talk about something else that's happened this week, which is that the BBC has announced swinging cuts to local radio. The headlines are that in almost all of the 39 local radio stations, there will be no unique programming after 2 p.m. on weekdays. Other than that, on weekday afternoons and evenings and at weekends, there will be regional shared programs, sometimes across what are now up to 4 distinct stations. And Leo, I need to come to you first on this. With your huge experience in local radio and as a former head of 4 BBC regions, I mean, I know you're really concerned about this, and it's personal, isn't it? Tell me how you're feeling about these proposals.
Well, I mean, I started at the BBC in 1985. I was a reporter at Radio Leicester, but one of the other things I did was to present the faith programme on Sunday morning, which was called Morning Extra. It was always multi-faith. It always got across the whole community, and we had very, very strong connections with those communities. So I think, as you say, 39 stations, all the sharing that's going to be, it's a proposal, we should say. We contacted the BBC last night. They're saying these are proposals. However, at the weekend where the most sharing takes place, it does mean that the 39 stations who have distinct faith programs, as I understand it, the proposal is that will go down to 10. So there will only be 10 programs, which means there will not be 29 other distinct programs. Well, with us today to discuss this are Bishop Beverley Mason, who's the Bishop of Warrington, and also the former assistant editor at BBC Radio Merseyside, and that's Pauline McAdam. Welcome to you both. Pauline, you left the BBC recently, but you're still very connected to the inside track. Have we got this right? This sounds pretty dramatic.
Yes. The notion is that there will be a local presence on every station for a portion of the week. A couple of stations will go a little longer during the weekday, but largely from afternoon or early evening on a Friday until the Monday morning, there will be regions then, and also a national programme, as far as I understand, overnight. And this is something they've done before, but you can imagine it's causing a lot of concern.
And on that specific point about faith programs, 39, we're told down to 10. We've got that from a number of different sources. We don't yet know which stations are directly affected. But what will sharing a faith program mean for a big, diverse city like Liverpool?
Well, according to the proposals, the programs for Liverpool, Manchester and Lancashire will share on a Sunday morning. So that becomes a Northwest faith program. And I suppose for me, obviously I'm going to bang the local drum, specifically regarding faith. Faith is obviously a universal construct, whichever faith you choose to follow, but it's experienced personally and it's experienced locally. So you tend to follow your faith in small communities, don't you? In small parishes, in your local temple, your local synagogue, your local mosque, your local church. And the local radio is essentially the platform for those local faiths. And actually, as we saw during COVID, although there was some regional and national programming, because needs must, those churches, those parishes, those communities had to close their doors, and local radio, in no small sense of the word, became the altar, the temple. Yeah. And whether that's in faith or journalism or music or sport, but in terms of particularly through the prism of faith, I think it sort of really encapsulates what we lose with local radio if we lose our local identity as a national or international, or in this sense, universal expression. We don't experience these things nationally or universally. We experience them personally. And if we lose our option to have a personal voice and a personal platform, we diminish the national and the universal conversation.
Bishop Beverley, what do you make of these proposals that, on the face of it, seem to be a contraction of the BBC's commitment to faith programming locally?
It causes me concern, and the way my brain works is that I'd love to ask questions around what is the vision for this, and what thought has really gone into this, because I echo and endorse everything that Pauline's been saying. We have come through an extraordinary period over the last couple of years with COVID, and we are now living through another extraordinary period. We're in this kind of phony COVID period, aren't we? Where we talk about post-COVID, but in fact we're not post-COVID. And in the meantime, we're confronted by significant financial crises, energy crises. Prior to COVID, a huge concern on the ground has been isolation, people living in isolation, and loneliness, and that loneliness has been such a trigger for mental health concerns. What we notice through the local radio is exactly that. It is local. People feel like they have befriended the communicators, the presenters on the radio station. There's a familiarity there. And there's messaging that's taking place for the local in such a rich and broad way that, the cities, looking at the Northwest, which is where I'm based, the cities of Manchester and Liverpool are so distinct and so diverse that what is being said for Manchester isn't necessarily going to be relative for people in Liverpool. And I think we're at risk of losing something hugely, hugely significant. There are going to be a number of foreseen consequences, but huge, I think, unforeseen consequences from this decision.
I mean, what I used to work at Radio Merseyside many years ago, just to say, Pauline, 30 years on, you haven't changed a bit. But I mean, one of the things there was that to stress what Pauline said about local radio being local communities and local people. I mean, there was a real feeling there that, the Archbishop, the Roman Catholic Archbishop, and Bishop David Shepherd, they were their bishops, they spoke for them. And, the idea that, that they'll be as interested in what's happening 30 miles down the road is just unthinkable, particularly for Scousers, I have to say. But the other thing I want to know is, if you're going to cut down these staff, if you're going to cut down the people who are gathering the stories, where are you going to find the stories? Where is the regional person who is responsible for faith across a vast area going to find their stories if they're not embedded in those local communities? They can't be everywhere. They can't be up in Carlisle and down in Stockport, at the same time. It's just not going to work. So it's not just that the sort of local sensibilities of listeners is going to be really badly affected. It's going to be the coverage. It just isn't going to be there. You're just not going to get it with those huge areas.
I think what I'd add to that, Rosie, is that notion, I think, has happened. The story is that this will help seed stories that will go onto a digital platform, and therefore more people will access them. And I think there are two fundamental problems with that. One is the notion that local stations are somehow mere news bureau, which is absolutely not the case, although I take your point about people being embedded in their communities. They are places where, unlike almost anywhere else in the BBC, you do not broadcast to your listeners. They don't let you. You broadcast with your listeners. And that is so important to get the truth of a story, if such a thing can exist. And I think the other thing is that, you're giving this voice to people. You mentioned the two bishops, Shepherd and Warlock, and they were very known at the time to be speaking for the people, in fact, against a political process which talked about things like managed decline. So that shows you just how important the voice of the people, the vox popularis, is in the political discourse, whether in faith or something even more important like football. You really need to know that these people are talking amongst themselves, not being talked to. That was the whole point of local radio. And I suppose, people might say, well, come on, we know that the BBC's licence fee is under pressure. Something has to give somewhere. You're just shouting for your corner. Yes, we are. But my view on that would be, this isn't a decision that's been made by bad people, but I do think it's a bad decision. BBC licence fee uses less than 5% of its funding for all of its local radio stations. The licence fee is a unique form of funding, and as such, it funds that which is unique first. And local radio, I'm afraid, is probably the unique offering that the BBC offers. Nobody else does. And unfortunately, the independent stations don't do anymore because they moved to this route of nationalisation.
I totally endorse what you're saying, Pauline. I think you've just articulated it beautifully. We're coming up to Remembrance Sunday as we record this podcast. Last year, we had a terrible situation in Liverpool of a bomber. It coincided with the civic service at Liverpool Cathedral. The cathedral was full. The bomber, there was a rumour, was the bomber intending to go to the cathedral, or was he really intending to go to the women's hospital? There was a big question mark around this. Now, the national news feed was profoundly incendiary in terms of the refugees, asylum seekers, and indeed the cathedral and Christians were being panned for the relationship that they were building with these minorities, the refugees, the asylum seekers. The story on the ground in Liverpool was very different because we had to diffuse and de-escalate what was happening nationally. And without that platform, that would have been potentially shocking because there was a tinderbox situation, I believe, in Liverpool, which the media were instrumental in containing by working right across the very layers of society in order for voices to be heard.
And that's about relationship, isn't it? That's about the relationships that have been built up over decades. As you were saying, Pauline, you don't broadcast to, you broadcast with. That is an important distinction. And what Bev is saying was only possible because of that trust that's been built up over a long time.
I think it's shown in so many ways. That's a really good example. A couple of other examples. You'll remember the infamous time that we were described in Liverpool as Self-Pity City by Boris Johnson. And that was because of the response that the city had to the execution of Ken Bigley. And one of those responses was to have a city memorial for him in one of the two cathedrals. When the young boy Rhys Jones was tragically killed, the service for his funeral took place in Liverpool's Anglican Cathedral, and it was broadcast on BBC Radio Merseyside because for the family particularly, the congregation who should have been there was the city. You can't fit a city into a cathedral, big as it is. But we were able to broadcast that requiem for that boy. The Hillsborough is another example, and you're seeing it with the Manchester Arena situation now, where because people are embedded with the communities, because it is happening to you as well, albeit you have to have a degree of impartiality, and you're a journalist, and you hear and you understand those stories. It is no accident that the justice that comes to those people over decades sometimes happens because there is a representation of their voice in a local media. Our archive told a story on the night of what was happening at Hillsborough, and it took over 30 years, and you would argue perhaps that justice hasn't been seen. But we're able to show that. That podcast is now on BBC Sounds. There you go. Local radio, digital platform.
I guess going on from what you were saying earlier, Pauline, we did ask the BBC for a statement, and they said there are currently, or we haven't lost any of our faith programmes. We're committed to reflecting all communities in all of our output, and will continue to do so. What, of course, they mean is there will be a faith programme in each station. They'll just be regional or national programmes. We don't know yet. These are proposals. But they've also said that the money they save, they want to increase the amount of digital, as you said, and also to provide an investigative fund so that there can be more journalism. But that's not going to cut it for you, is it?
No, I suppose I saw a lovely tweet this week from somebody, not in Merseyside, another local radio station, because of course every station is passionate about where it is, and so it should be. And this woman just tweeted, yes, we do online, we do podcasts, we have WhatsApp, but radio, and in particular local radio, she said, it's the person sitting next to you in the car, it's the left-hand side of the bed. And I just thought, that's
lovely.
it. You don't digitise that.
Do you think that the BBC sort of thought it through? I mean, you'd hope that they had, but in terms of the faith programme, did they just think, well, weekends, we need to do something about weekends, so we'll put everything into regions? Do you think they thought through the implications for the faith programming when they made that decision? Because sometimes decisions have been made about religion on the BBC which haven't always seemed to have been well thought out.
Local sport is staying, we should say. So there's been a recognition that local sport stays, but not local faith.
I mean, Leo might be better placed with his experience in senior management of the BBC to answer how much thought is put through to these decisions. I mean, of course they've thought, because it is about making a choice, isn't it? They're making choices. I just think they've made the wrong choice. And yes, there is...
And listenership is falling, let's face it. It's a digital world. Let's just address that. There is not as many listeners as there used to be in the past.
That's true, but then listenership fell on Radio 4 this year, and nobody's talking about cutting that.
I mean, the MPs and Lords are against it, and I just wonder if they make enough noise in Parliament, whether there's a chance that the BBC might think again on this.
I mean, perhaps Leo will remember there was I think it's almost 10 years ago exactly, that a very similar initiative was planned, and it was called Delivering Quality First. They always have these euphemisms, don't they? And
DQF.
It failed for exactly that. There was a grassroots rebellion from the listeners themselves, from politicians, from the clergy, from everywhere.
Yeah.
Who knows? I don't think this is over yet, but it's sad that it's come back.
We have been here before.
Yeah, and Bishop Bev, some of your fellow bishops are making noise about this, and that's important, isn't it? I mean, they do have a voice. You have a voice.
Really, yeah. We're speaking, the bishops are speaking quite strongly in terms of public service broadcast and the significance of it, and challenging the government in terms of, in a sense, forcing the BBC down particular pathways. We have the best media in the world. We know that. We don't celebrate this sufficiently. We're very quick to criticise. We'll criticise politicians, we'll criticise journalists, soft targets, and yet we only have to look across the world to see what poor journalism looks like. And in this world of, talking about what we all know so well, but this world of fake news and disinformation, there's an integrity to the broadcasting we get in this country that we do want to celebrate, rejoice, and hold on to. We're going to be impoverished if we lose some of this stuff.
Your colleague and I'm sure our friend, Bishop of Leeds, Nick Baines, spoke in the Lords yesterday about this. And one of the things he said was, yesterday I asked a friend who works in public service broadcasting what she would focus on in a debate such as this. Her response was immediate: imagine a world without it. And I think that really sums up a lot of what you've both been saying. Thank you so much. Bishop Bev, while I've got you, it would be odd if I didn't just raise with you briefly what I talked about at the beginning, the living in love and faith conversations that have been happening this week, and Bishop Stephen Croft and the Bishops of Worcester and Dudley putting out their statements. Can I just ask you for a response to what they've said?
I think it's great that Bishop Stephen has made such a statement. It's informed, it's after a period of thinking, of praying, of learning, of listening. And that's effectively what living in love and faith has been about. Listening to the church. It's the first time in the history of the church that such an exercise has taken place, where we've wanted to hear what God is saying to the church. And we have, so we entered a 2-year process of listening to what's being said. And the bishops at the moment are deliberating on all of this. So we're going to hear more of those who share a similar view to Stephen, and those for whom they hold a more traditional view of Christianity. And the tension for us as a church is, how do we hold the two, yet completely honour human dignity, and enable things to move forward. We are at a time of change. You use the language of the sea of change, and the currents are moving. And so the key question is how, and is it possible as we move? Is it possible to hold the whole together? We speak of the church as the body of Christ. How does the body, cope with, deal with, embrace change?
Okay. Bishop Beverley Mason, thank you so much. Pauline McAdam, thank you for joining us too. Just before we end, Leo, have you got any little stories for us for the end?
Yeah, a little story for you here. Nice story. Despite being translated into hundreds of different languages, there's never been a Welsh translation of the Quran. But all that's going to change, because Laura Jones from Cardiff, who's a Welsh scholar and a Muslim, said that the number of Welsh-speaking Muslims has increased a lot. And I guess we're going to see that when the census results come out very, very soon. So she's decided that she's going to change that and translate the Quran into Welsh. There will be a Welsh language version of the Quran.
Oh, we need to hear from our friend Azim on that one, don't we? We'll get him on to chat about it at another time. Well, that is this week's Religion Media Centre podcast. Do let us know what you think. Share it widely. But for now, from Leo, Rosie and myself, thanks so much for spending some time with us. We'll be back next Friday. Bye for now. The Religion Media Centre is an impartial and independent organisation providing an expert resource for the media and other interested parties to help the reporting and understanding of religion and beliefs. You can find news, fact sheets, briefings and lots more on the website at religionmediacentre.org.uk, where you can also sign up for a daily roundup of stories about religion and belief from the UK and around the world, straight to your inbox. If you'd like to support the podcast and the work we do, contributions are very welcome. Thank you if you do, have or will. It all helps us continue to tell the stories that matter, and it's hugely appreciated.